All right, guys. Here's the first, I guess, lesson in terms of material that we need to cover. So this is kind of the start of chapter one. Okay. You'll hear me reference some numbers. So this is chapter one. This is number 5. All right. What I want you guys to do, there's a Google form that is in this lesson on the classroom site. I want you to fill out that question where it says, list 3 things that you know about the Constitution of the United States. So I kind of want you to pause the video now and then go in and try to tell me 3 things that you are aware of in regards to the Constitution of the United States, whether it be how it was created, where it stands today, some elements of it. It does not matter what. I just want to know a few things that you guys actually know. So you can go ahead and pause the video and fill that part out now. Okay, so let's take a look at what I want you guys to be able to do after today. It says, explain in context one of the basic principles which help define the government of the United States. All right, so when we're looking at this, these basic principles right here, all right, there are 5 basic principles that we're going to kind of define today that will be towards the latter part of this lesson. That I want you to be able to kind of get an understanding of, by definition, what they are, and then what they actually look like in like some modern day examples and historically what these have looked like. All right. And that's what kind of this whole chapter is about. So we want to start with a little bit, before we get into the actual principles, a history of the Constitution. All right. And if you guys remember from your past social studies courses, our Constitution that it is today, it was not the first. All right. So if you think about this, do any of you know the name of that first Constitution? All right. Obviously, I can't call on you now as you see this, but that was, if you remember ever hearing of the Articles of Confederation. All right. This was our first attempt at a Constitution. They're considered a failure, the Articles. And we're going to go into a little bit of the reason why and then how that led to our current Constitution. The biggest failure of the Articles would be the idea that it provided for really weak national government. Okay, the Articles focused on the states having pretty much all of the power and federal or national government being incredibly limited, which for some, I mean, that's an idea that some even like today, but it was so limited at that time that it was unable to do some basic things that a country needs to be able to pull off. All right. So like I said, it had little power to do its job. And so I want to give you some of these examples of what we're talking about here in terms of how it was unable to do its job. First one you could consider here would, like, each state only had 1 vote in Congress regardless of its size. So if you think of that, what does that mean today? So a state like Wyoming, all right, our least populous state, all right, they would have, under the Articles, well, Wyoming wasn't a state at the time, but they would have just as many votes as, let's say, California, all right? So your largest state, your smallest state, regardless of their size, would have the same amount of votes in Congress, all right? So there were some issues there in terms of what one state represented in terms of population as opposed to another, that not being really equal. Congress didn't have the power to tax, okay? So there could have been taxes at the state level, but there was no federal tax. So you say, well, then what's the big deal here? All right, well, they rely on tax dollars to provide services from the federal level, all right? They couldn't regulate foreign and interstate commerce, so we're talking about trade, okay? So with the lack of the ability of the federal government to regulate, it was kind of done at the state level, which caused some issues. There was no executive branch under the Articles of Confederation, all right? So what we're familiar with the 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, there was no executive branch, all right? So there was no what then, all right? There's no president. There's not that one branch that can kind of do some of the powers that we have now given the executive branch. There's no national court system, okay? Not sure what you guys are aware of the responsibilities and the powers of the Supreme Court, but it's a very powerful branch, and they have an important job to do, as you'll learn throughout this year. So that lack of a federal court system left it to the states to decide a lot of things. If you were going to amend the Constitution, it required every single state, all right, to vote for the amendment to add that to the Constitution. That's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to get over 50% sometimes to get something done, let alone to get all states to buy in for an amendment. You could see how it'd be very difficult to get anything done. Even laws required nine out of the 13 colonies had to approve it. That becomes difficult because, laws in Congress now are we have what is called simple majority, so over 50% to get through each house. So it was very difficult to get things done and understand why they did this. Okay, they did this. They were so fearful of federal government having so much power because you think of, when they founded the country, freeing themselves from Britain, the monarchy, where the monarch had so much power. They had so much fear that nobody would kind of buy into an executive branch or too much power given to the federal government that they pretty much gave all the power to the states. Okay, but like I said, it had its issues. You have, if you guys remember, learn about Shays' Rebellion, when I won't get into the complete background of it, where basically you have this rebellion from this group of individuals, and there was no sense of power from the federal government to kind of push back on that rebellion. And so the eyes would open up to the idea of, we might need to make some changes. So they would. So let's get into what happens here. 1787, we know delegates are going to meet in Philadelphia. All right. And it would be here that they're going to abandon the Articles of Confederation and they're going to replace it with a new Constitution, replace it with the Constitution that we know of as today. All right. So let's say, what is a Constitution? Hopefully this isn't a new term for you, but a new Constitution, that's what establishes the framework for government. A lot of countries have a Constitution, but they're all different. The term Constitution isn't unique to the United States. All right. Like I said, other countries have one. Canada has a Constitution. So what you have within that, though, is how your particular government is going to function. All right. Maybe some powers given to government, or maybe certain things that they cannot do, which we'll talk about eventually. All right. And the U.S. Constitution establishes the basic structure of our government. All right. And it creates what is known as a federal republic. You hear the time we're a democracy. Okay. But the way that our government is structured, it's a federal republic. So we have this union of states. We have 50 states. When it says it's a Republican type of government, we're not talking Republican in terms of party. We're talking republic where power is, and this is where we'll get into some debate here eventually, but by definition, power rests with the people who then elect their representatives. So the federal republic style of government is we elect representatives to then go into Congress and represent us. And that's what we hope they do. And if they do not, we're supposed to vote them out until we feel as though we get a representative that truly represents us. Okay. And if they do, maybe they'll get reelected. If they don't, we should vote them out. All right. That's on paper. We know it doesn't always work that way. There's a lot of different things that play a role with this. But on paper, that's how a federal republic should function and how they created this Constitution. And when they did this, it said they had to be careful because they also need to protect the interest of the individual states. All right. So when they create this Constitution, they know when they go meet, because they kind of meet and they meet in secret almost. Okay. When they do this, because they know that there's going to be a lot of pushback, because if we give the federal government a lot of power, all right, or more power, we're going to get a lot of pushback, because the articles, they were created because we were so fearful of people rejecting the government if we give federal government too much power. Okay. So they had to protect the interest of the individual states, and that comes in mind with some of the ways that they created the Constitution. So these 5 principles, when it says they adopted the 5 principles, I mean, it's kind of something that was mentioned in a lot of the Federalist, Anti-Federalist papers, some of these terms that I'm going to show you. And it's kind of, as history has moved forward, it's something that we know is a big part of the principles of our Constitution. So when we take a look at these, here they are. So we're talking about popular sovereignty, limited government, federalism, separation of powers, and checks and balances. So what I want to take a look at is how do we define these five? I'm not going to get in too much depth because that is what is going to be future lessons. All right, I just want to kind of define them, kind of gloss them over. All right, and then we'll eventually get in debate. What do these look like in modern times? How are these represented? How are some of them maybe not truly represented as we have historically maybe not had a true representation of all people in our country? So let's take a look at this. First off, popular sovereignty. All right, what is this? By definition, and I'll read it here, all right, it's the principle that governmental authority is derived from the people. Under this principle, government governs with the consent of the governed. Okay, so it's the idea of people having the power. All right, and this is one of those, obviously, when we talk about this historically, all right, who in particular, okay, is derived from the people. When obviously when this Constitution is created, who can actually vote? All right, white males who got a little bit of money or some property. All right, so we'll get into that eventually. But popular sovereignty in itself, like let's take it to present day. What does it mean? Power given to the people. All right, so one of the biggest examples is the picture that I have there. Our biggest power that we may have, okay, this could obviously be debated too, is our power to vote. All right, and that was something that we govern with the consent of the governed. So that means their job of governing, all right, them doing their job, going to Washington, doing what they're supposed to do, that is with the consent of the governed, us. All right, now, like I said, we could have a good discussion of, do they always truly represent us? All right, maybe, maybe not. If you didn't vote that person in, but they're in, you may not feel that they represent you. Okay, if you voted that person in and they pass laws that you like, maybe you do feel that way. If you vote that person in and they do not do what they said they were going to do, then what do you do next? You vote them out or whatever it may be. So there's a lot of layers to this, but that is what popular sovereignty is. All right, power to the people. You can think of it that way, the will of the people. Next one is limited government. Holds that a government can only exercise the powers granted to it. Government must be conducted according to the rule of law. All right, so there are certain things that government can or cannot do, and this obviously gets debated all the time. Okay, so anytime there's any government action taken, whether it's from the president, whether it's from Congress, okay, we often can they even do this? Okay, according to our Constitution, there are certain things that they are able to do. Sometimes that Constitution gets stretched, sometimes it does not. And there are some things specifically in the Constitution that the government cannot do. All right, I can think of 10 amendments, if you know what the name of those are, when you guys have to do your assignment, that could be one of your examples. All right, and government should only be able to exercise the powers granted to it. All right, think of something like, right, what can they not limit? What are they unable to limit? Speech. All right, so freedom of speech. There are some limitations to speech, okay, and we'll talk about those later on in the year. But that idea, those first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, okay, that's a good example of limited government. And we'll get into that, like I said, in a little bit later too. So federalism is the next one, system of government in which power is divided between a central authority and constituent units. Under the U.S. Constitution, this principle is reflected in the division of power between the national government and the states. So to break this down, this is the division of power between federal government and state government. And some of this is shared. Not all of this power is, there are exclusive powers for the national government and there are exclusive powers for state governments, okay? And there are some that they share. All right, and so we'll get into that a little bit more. But how that works, that relationship between state governments and federal government and even local government, okay, is what federalism is. Separation of powers, okay, so requires a distribution of government power among independent branches. Each of the branches has a specific field of authority and unique set of responsibilities within the operation of the government, okay? You see by the picture there, we have 3 branches of government who have 3 unique specific powers. All right, legislative branch has a specific powers, executive branch has specific powers, and so does the judicial. All right, and it was when they created the Constitution, it was this idea of making sure that each branch can do those things. They have to be cohesive oftentimes, and they somewhat work together. Judicial kind of works somewhat independently from the other two. Like I said, we'll get into that also later. but understanding separation of powers as one of those principles. Checks and balances. Here we go. Number 5. System of for controlling government power. Under this principle, the branches of government possess the ability to restrain certain actions of other branches. This is that idea, like, let's say that the legislative branch passes, it passes both the House and the Senate, but the president does not like the bill, they can veto it, okay? A system of checks and balances. It's the idea that you can't give too much power to one branch. So it allows the other two branches to check the power of the other two. They all have a check, some sort of check over the other two. All right. They have, some of them are multiple checks, and we'll get into that list when we get here. Okay. So you've separated their powers with the previous one. You can do specific things, but we don't want to let you abuse that power. And that's why we have these other two branches for you to work with. Okay. And that's that kind of idea of checks and balances and what the whole this system was set up for. All right. So those are the 5. All right. Like I said, it's just an introduction. There's a lot to these. These are stuff we're going to fall on these throughout the whole year, and they'll be referenced throughout these 5 will be referenced throughout the whole year as we go back and forth and we talk about checks and balances, and because a lot of this will play into other things that we're going to study this year. Okay. So your assignment, which is attached here too, that is the Google Doc document that's going to have that last row is going to be blank. I want you to complete the section and come up with modern day examples. So when you see federalism, I don't want you to obviously redefine it. I want you to try to find or think of some examples of what does federalism look like today that you can think of. All right, what are some checks and balances? And there are checks and balances that are present today that were just as present before. All right, there's certain checks that have been there since they created this Constitution. So that row, I want you to come up with 2 examples, okay? 2 examples, and that's it, of some modern day examples. All right, don't want to get too repetitive here. If you have any questions, make sure that you email me before the day that it's due. All right, so take a look at that. See if you have any questions. It shouldn't take you too long. You can look these up. Some Google searches will help you. Just make sure that you're applying it to the right principle. All right.